Hello everyone, Leafreed here, and I was up north and I decided I'd read a book on someone's recommendation. Apparently it's adapted to a show, again recently, and was a movie in the past, and that is Interview with the Vampire. I kept saying Interview with a Vampire, but no, it's the Vampire. Even though he's not the last vampire, as you find out in the story. But I really liked this novel. It was really well written. I really enjoyed it, and on the back it does say it is a page turner, which is very, very true. I read this in probably 3 days, and it's roughly 300 and something pages, and so you can have a look at the size of the text there and what it's like, and it just flows. The prose, I think, is really, really nice. That's what I've been told that is really nice about this book. And if I think I had to encapsulate the mood of this book, it's yearning. It's longing for something that's lost. And I'll get into that in a second. But what this book is really known for is, whenever it was written by Anne Rice, it kind of it revolutionized the whole vampire trope that Bram Stoker set out about, based on the whole letters being sent between Transylvania and England. And honestly, I don't even know the full story of that because I haven't read it yet. Apparently it's not that exciting, but maybe I should read it just for the case of it. So in this book, there's a lot of things that Anne kind of tends to change up about. That she changes up about the vampires. So things like, the hokey garlic thing, crucifixes no longer scare them. It's more so based around, they can't, they can't, have no reflection. So they're almost basically human, but they do drink blood. They do have to sleep at night and can never be out during the day or they will die or something. It's actually never, clarify what happens. They can be killed through dissolving the body or dismemberment, but if you stab them through the heart, they just kind of wither and wilt, but eventually come back to life just very scarred, as happens to one of the characters. And I think what is, again, deeply moving about this book is Anne's determination to make everything just beautiful. And so because it is written from, a female perspective, there aren't a bunch of action sequences or anything. It's very much about the emotions of the characters. And what I really do like about it is that even though this is set out as a book about vampires, when you actually read it, you kind of almost forget. We don't forget the vampire part, but it's just kind of another aspect of the characters. So it's not, again, with these revolutionary pieces of media that define a certain item or a trope, it's never just, here's this guy and he can suck blood and walk at night. It's also that he has a certain persona, a certain struggle that is also reflected, and, his aspects of being a vampire reinforce his personal convictions or his personal struggles. And so what is his personal struggles? And so the way the story is laid out is it's modern day San Francisco, and there's a boy interviewing this vampire, this guy who claims to be a vampire that he met in this bar or something. And he basically has a tape recorder. He says, I'm going to interview you so I can, because I'm a journalist and I want to get this story and see, what it's like. And so it's, this entire story is just the vampire recounting his entire life, basically, over the course of an evening with this kid. And that's kind of the whole story. And so so it all goes back into the past, and sometimes he'll interject and come out of that, and the boy will have questions about things. And so the main character, Louis, is a French plantation owner in the late 1700s New Orleans. Again, it's a very interesting setup where you have this very specific historical time frame where Louis, he's the eldest or elder brother in the family of at least a few siblings. I think there's a sister and a brother, but it seems like he's the eldest. And so what happens is his younger brother essentially, it's the late 1700s, and they hear word that there's a revolution in France and that people are being executed left and right. and his little brother has this vision and this revelation that he says, I need to go to France to preach the word of God and end this revolution and make people regain their sanity. And so Louis's response is that he doesn't care. He kind of laughs at his brother, like, okay, that's a great story, but you're crazy. And then it's later after that where, again, it's not clear by happenstance, or as Louis put it, it's almost as if the devil pushed him, but his brother ends up falling from the gallery and breaking his neck and dies. And so Louis is struck with guilt, and he blames himself, of course, for his brother's death, because he denies his dream. And so that's another thing I've really appreciated about this book, is there's a lot of intertwining of religious, spiritual, and Christian themes that never run, in a preachy manner or against the narrative of the story. It's never shoehorned in. It's just very natural. And I think what really defines this book is, again, as I said, yearning, beauty, and trying to find the beauty in life when it seems like things have been taken from you. And what I love about it is the tone of Louis's character is that he's kind of this agnostic Catholic at this point, where he's kind of lost, not exactly his faith in God, but he has his brother dies, and then he becomes a vampire, and then he's still like wondering, does God exist? And so it's such an interesting, mode to have this, situation where a vampire is like kind of questioning and is having this spiritual struggle whether or not God exists. It's something you would never think of, but it's like a core, I think, theme to the book. And of course, when you live a life in which your life doesn't end, then again, it's like, what's the purpose? What's the point? And so, yes, this is a book about vampires, but it's also a book really about existentialism and about maybe the loss of religion, the loss of spirituality, and this character trying to struggle and find it within himself. And so that's why it's this reaching out for beauty, this reaching out for other ideas and things to give him hope, reaching out for hope. That is the main kind of driving message, I think, of this book. And I think I'll find it somewhere here, but there's one passage in here that just struck me, and it's the one thing that basically has stayed with me after I've finished this book, which is where, and so in between this, Louis is kind of assaulted and transformed into a vampire by this other character called Lestat, and we'll get to that in a second. And Louis is just kind of like, all right, I guess I'm a vampire now. That happened, I guess. Shucks, gosh, golly gee. And so Louis he's still in the sorrow of his brother dying, and then this other awful thing happens to him. And Louis is just a character that you see in fiction where he just feels too much, he thinks too much, he's just filled with so much sensitivity, and it just destroys him. And it's I'm not sure if it's a writer's trope, but it's like, there are certain writers that are like, this is my favorite character, let's see how much suffering we can make them go through, just to get as many emotions out of them as possible. And so Louis, the one scene in particular, he's become a vampire, and this awful thing has happened to him, and he's in, you can kind of imagine it in the sense that, besides the whole vampire part, when you have this awful tragedy occur in your family, you have to think to yourself, is there a God? Does God exist? Why would this tragedy and this pain happen? And, why do I have to go through this guilt? Why does this reality exist? And it's this thing where you want to believe in God, but you also have to struggle with the reality of what's happened and what's occurred. And on top of that, there's this one scene where Louis, he basically goes to his new coffin, his first night as a vampire, and it's in the oratory that his brother used to pray at, like constantly all the time. And it talks about, the rose bush and the rose garden that's grown over, the unused doors to this small oratory where he keeps his coffin. And he enters this room with the paintings of the saints on the wall. And it's just, I don't know, it's just this really well done, beautiful scene that's painted for you, where you feel the character's sorrow and you feel his, not his hopelessness, but his reaching out for hope. I don't know if there's a word for that, but he it's almost like he still wants to believe that there's good in the world, and he's surrounding himself with all these icons and all these memories of hope and these good things, but he still has to deal with the reality that's been presented to him and struggle with it. And so the way that his soul has kind of died is almost a metaphor for him becoming a vampire, and vice versa. And I found it really, really interesting and moving, and I really, really appreciated that. But again, this whole book, it talks about the plantation, the giant French windows, the doors, the candelabras, the candlelight, the rose bushes. Like, everything is just so romantic. The vampires have these very pale faces, aquiline features. And so everything is just very, written with a lot of prose. Let me try to find a nice passage, actually. Oh, I think I found it, actually. So lock yourself in, I said, embracing my coffin, hoisting it and carrying it down the brick stairs. I could hear the locks snapping on the French doors above, the swoosh of the drapes. The sky was pale but still sprinkled with stars, and another light rain blew now on the breeze from the river, speckling the flagstones. I opened the door of my brother's oratory, shoving back the roses and thorns which had almost sealed it, and set the coffin on the stone floor beside the prie-dieu. I could almost make out the images of the saints on the walls. "Paul," I said softly, addressing my brother, "for the first time in my life I feel nothing for you, nothing for your death, and for the first time I feel everything for you, feel the sorrow of your loss as if I never before knew feeling, you see." And so, it just, everything is just about, loss and longing, and Louis is just such a tortured character, and so he's the main vehicle by which we go through this story. And so on to the actual vampire aspects of it. So Lestat is this obviously older vampire who is this blonde, haughty, I would say kind of almost borderline sadistic character who doesn't care how many humans he kills. He demonstrates to Louis that they can feed on rats. I immediately think of Vampire the Masquerade when I think about vampires feeding on rats, because that's the only Malkavian route. Anyway. And so there's that aspect where they can feed on animals to survive, but it just feels like nothing. And so Lestat enjoys, it's to him, it's all show. It's all about, whining, dining, seducing men, women, children, whatever, and then taking back to his place and then draining them of their blood in this big show. It's kind of his raison d'etre to have this, theater to keep him entertained, basically, because when you're immortal, you're extremely, bored. And it's a bit, I would say, borderline hokey. The fact that they kill so many people throughout this book and they never once get questioned by the police. It's like they kill people in their apartment, and the next night they bring back more people to also kill their apartment. And there's this one line saying, we always had to contend with, the plague and, droughts and deaths and natural things, and people were dying left, right, and which is, I guess, kind of true. But never once are they ever questioned by the police. It's just kind of like, all right, well, whatever. We'll let that slide for the romance of it. And it's funny, the one time where they are getting suspicion placed upon them is when they travel to Transylvania, but that's another story. So Lestat, basically what he does, he assaults Louis, he drains him almost of all his blood, and then Lestat bites his own wrist and pours his blood from his wrist into Louis, and he fills his body with all of his blood to the point of his death. And so that's how a vampire is made. And so why does Lestat do this? And if I recall correctly, it's because he just wanted Louis' estate. He just wanted the money, basically, so that he can continue his fancy balls and dinners and be this Hannibal Lecter-esque character who ends up, totally, living this lavish lifestyle. So he did it for money initially, but as it turns out, he really was just super lonely. And so Louis doesn't understand this until later, but Lestat basically just, when you have all of this immortal life and these adventures and you have no one to share it with, it feels so empty and boring. And so that's kind of how the relationship evolves. And just on their relationship in general, it's very interesting because there's something very enigmatic about the relationship that I've seen a lot of what I would call, kind of gay relationship literature, where you have one character who's the sorrowful masochist and the other character that is the abrasive sadist. And so it's kind of this weird, abusive, parasitic relationship that it's just I don't know. I just understand now, like the Fujo mind. I understand now this character dynamic and why it's so prevalent. And I feel that sometimes you'll have a lot of fanfic about two male characters being in a relationship, and it gets very out of character, and it gets out of character in the way that this book presents these two characters. I'm like, oh, I get it. Oh, okay, I get it now. And the real kind of drive, I think, of that is, I guess, Anne wanted to kind of get all of the emotions out of these characters. So when you have, two characters that are happily together, it's kind of, I guess, hard to get all those different emotions out of them. So if you want to see them suffer, if you want to see them happy, if you want to see them, struggle with something, I guess it's more interesting to have a toxic dynamic than a positive dynamic, because then you just have a lot more emotions in general. That's kind of what I'm speculating, but I kind of get it now, And so, as Louis becomes a vampire, Lestat kind of teaches him the ropes to what he has to do. But the main aspect of the relationship is that Lestat does not tell him everything. And so he uses that knowledge edge essentially to keep him in the dark and keep him subservient to him so he doesn't leave. And it's by that very nature, the fact that Lestat will not be totally forthcoming with Louis, that Louis is, he's desperate for knowledge and truth and whatever, and he honestly, he very quickly begins to hate Lestat because he doesn't care for anything around him or anyone. He's just totally almost self-centered, and it's no wonder he wants someone around, because no one can stand him because he's an arrogant asshole. And so Louis, from the very fact that Lestat will not tell him everything, begins to, or designs his escape from this relationship and this life that he's been living. And so they'll go out and feed on, random people, prostitutes or whoever, boys, girls, never old people. Actually, I just realized it's always like, women or men, but never, and it's always they have to, seduce them or whatever. Or sometimes they just take them in the field. Sometimes they'll be just slaves that they'll just, take whenever. And so it's interesting that it's really cool how they describe the feeling of actually sucking on the blood and how it works. And it's essentially that the blood flows into the fangs, into the body, and all the way directly to the heart. And because you're technically dead, it's literally the only thing that makes you feel alive. So a vampire is always cold. They always have pale, cold skin to the touch, which is kind of like the signs. And it's only until they take in the blood of another person that they end up essentially, they can feel warmth again. The color returns to their faces and their cheeks and everything. And there's also this very intimate exchange where literally you can feel the other person's heartbeat as you're draining them. And so as Louis or Lestat is draining the blood of someone else, they can feel that other person's heartbeat and their heartbeat and this parasitic, life force that they're, taking away from them. And so in a way, it's this very intimate thing that is, of course, all metaphorical for sexual relations or whatever. But the way it's described is actually kind of cool and makes a lot of sense. Like, why would a vampire, if they can just survive on rats and other kinds of animals, why would they go after humans? And the only explanation is that it's basically like a drug to them. It's their high. And so, it did kind of disturb me a little bit that they just kind of got used to killing people, and it's at no point did they feel any remorse. There's this, and near the end of the book, one of the vampires dies, and I thought maybe that would shake them up and remind them what death is like. But throughout most of the book, they just kind of see humans as, well, livestock, animals. We can do whatever we want them, we can feed on them, and there's no reason for us to care for them because we're better than them. And I guess it was a little bit disappointing because it felt like it was kind of going in that direction, where Louis was describing Lestat, the way he feeds, the way he takes on humans and takes them essentially. He said it was always motivated by some kind of grudge or revenge. And I was expecting Louis to be kind of more of a character to stand up to Lestat and say, look, we just can't, take human life because we were human once. Where's the morality in that? But it doesn't really go there. Just Lestat is just a bad guy, essentially. And I hate to make this comparison, but I literally thought of another vampire property, Morbius, where it's literally the same thing. Where you have these two gifted kids, Dr. Michael Morbius and the other character who was in the wheelchair, and they were both bullied, but their reactions to their experiences were so different and so interesting. Where Michael Morbius was like, okay, I found this vampirical power. I'm going to use it to heal myself, heal my terrible disease, and then I'm going to use it to make humanity better. I'm going to sell my drugs and pharmaceuticals and whatever. But his friend, his best friend, who's been with him this whole time, basically says no, because we were so bullied and so looked down upon. I want my revenge. And he says, I want to take my revenge on the humans. Finally, I can be in a position of power, and you're in a position of power, but I want to use my position of power for tyranny and revenge and for my own self-serving needs rather than to be selfless. And Morbius is not a good movie. Don't go watch it, but maybe go watch it, because like that dynamic and that theme, it felt very early 2000s. It reminded me of like the good times of when superhero movies weren't just associated with Marvel. Some of them were actually decently good and had pretty good themes to them. And so I was kind of waiting for that theme to emerge, but Louis is just kind of, he can only escape Lestat. He can't stand up to him. But yeah, it's something I just thought of. And so finally, the relationship develops, and what happens is Louis, after spending many nights with Lestat and seeing how he treats people and how he treats him, he's basically like, I can't do this anymore. And they have the whole thing, where he takes, the blood and he, draws it from someone's breast and fills his wine glass and says, delectable. Louis, have a taste, won't you? And so Louis is like, you know what? I'm good. I'm done. And so I can't remember exactly the secret events, but Louis is like, okay, I'm leaving. I'm done. And Lestat kind of predicts and knows this, that he's going to leave. And so I think it's the first night that he has his first taste or his first kill, or maybe it's after that. And Louis comes across this girl, this 5-year-old girl, who is in her house, and her mother, who has been dead for like several days, and she's crying for her to get up. It's not clear if it was disease or maybe someone murdered her. I think it was probably disease. And so this poor little girl is crying for her mother to get up, and she's completely defenseless. And Louis, in, I guess, his passion or curiosity, looks at her after just feeding, and he's still intoxicated with a blood rush, and he ends up feeding on this little girl. And he feels her little heart beating against her desire to live, and he feels... And he stops in the middle of his bloodlust, and he realizes what he's done. He kind of throws her to the ground and immediately regrets his decision. But Lestat takes note of this, and he realizes, this was the one thing that tempted Louis. And so Lestat, later that evening, brings her back to their place, and he turns this 5-year-old girl into a vampire, and her name is Claudia. And actually, this is kind of my favorite part of the book, where you have... and so Lestat... He doesn't say it outright, but he basically, the basic message is, now, Louis, you can't leave me, because now you have to care for this other child, for this other creature. And Louis immediately realizes what he's done and resents him, but also loves this girl like his daughter. And it's this weird thing where the vampires, as they age, they become less and less human, and they less and less think of themselves as like normal relationships, or father and daughter and brother and stranger. They just kind of, like, for example, what happens to Claudia is that, yes, she's a 5-year-old girl, but she develops this sense of hyper maturity. She becomes the iconic horror trope of the little girl who's actually haunted or evil, is more like way more mature beyond her years and is inhabited by some evil spirit. And so Claudia has this ability to basically have this superhuman intelligence. Her passion is reading books, actually, and her modus operandi of tricking other humans and feeding on them, because she's almost as callous as Lestat at some points. She'll basically ask for strangers to pick her up and carry her back to her house or whatever, to her father. And while they have her cradled in their arms, she'll sickle them right there. And so actually this is my favorite part of the book, because it's just the three of them, and it's a really fun dynamic where you have the girl who's developing, you have Louis who still resents his master or his so-called master, but he also takes on the role of almost a father figure and a lover to this little girl. And so they sleep in the same coffin, and it's very just wholesome, really, and there's nothing weird or sexual about it. They're just kind of these two people that just exist. But it's weird, because she ends up developing this consciousness that is not of a girl anymore, that's more of a woman. And well, I'll tell you how that develops later and how she resents them for that. But for the time being, they basically coexist happily until eventually, it's like 60 years later, is this crazy jump in time, and Claudia finally, asks Louis, I forget what triggers it, but she basically asks Louis, how did I turn into a vampire? Well, like, where did I come from? And Louis eventually tells her the truth, that, it was actually me. I was actually tempted by you, and I drank your blood initially, and then Lestat did this thing, and she gets all flustered and angry, and she flies off into the night, and then he catches up with her and pleads with her to please understand. And she eventually comes around to him, and she realizes that the real enemy here is Lestat, who is basically keeping them under his control, that he turned them both against their will, because he wants things to abuse and control, more or less. And so Claudia says to Louis, she's fully developed now mentally, and she says, I have a plan to basically, I'm going to kill Lestat, and I'm going to, get revenge, and we're going to escape and go basically to Europe to find the other vampires. And so what transpires is there's this back and forth, but basically, what was it? I think they buy their tickets. Oh no, that's right. So they buy their tickets to the New World for this ship, and by this point it's almost the 1800s. And so Claudia, what she does is she brings this young boy as a treat to Lestat, but she's filled his body with absinthe and laudanum, I guess, which was morphine or something back in the day. And so after Lestat feasts on his blood, they never bring up if this is a case anywhere else, but when he feasts on his blood, the qualities of the blood and the fact that the boy is basically like very much alcohol, to the point where I think there were two boys, and the other boy actually died because he was so drugged. Lestat basically is so drugged he just lies there on the bed and he can't defend himself. And that's when Claudia, in a typical vampire fashion, because she's been reading up on all the old vampire lore, trying to figure out what exactly they are and how to kill them, she takes a knife and basically stabs him multiple times, and then through the heart. And what happens is Lestat shrivels up and wrinkles and becomes this husk of a person. And so they're like, is he dead? Or whatever. I'm like, he looks dead. And so they put him in a body bag, throw him over, the side of the river, and just say bye-bye. And so it's a few days later, they're getting ready to leave, and, basically, there's this one boy that Lestat was seeing who was actually aware that he was a vampire and letting him feed on him, which is a whole big twist. It turns out he was actually turned into a vampire, I believe, by Lestat. And so he finds out they're leaving, and it turns out that, of course, stabbing a vampire through the heart doesn't kill them. And so Lestat is alive, and he ambushes them, and he basically, this huge fight, there's a fire, and their apartment burns down. But Claudia and Louis are able to get away. They got on the ship, and they leave for the new world, leaving Lestat and all those memories behind. It's also very funny because I believe correctly that is like that whole part, which is maybe 2/3 of the book, or at least half the book, is part 1. And I understand what Anne Rice was, what her plan was, that because the next part, they go to Transylvania to find the ancient homeland of the vampires, and that's maybe only like 30 pages, and that's the end of part 2. So she had this idea that every location is going to be the end of a certain part, but it's just very funny how it's just just totally improportional as to which parts are which. And so funny, the Transylvania one, it's very short. They basically get there trying to find vampires. They have a bunch of superstitious old people who, some of the things, do work. Like, so the things that do kill a vampire, if you decapitate them or destroy their body. And so there's this whole thing where they come to this village, and there's this old lady, and there's this Englishman and his wife who were traveling there sightseeing, and she was bitten by a vampire, and so she died, and they don't know. Well, she's not going to turn into one because she wasn't given the blood, but they don't know. And so as an extra measure, they're like, we need to decapitate your dead wife just to be sure. And he's like, absolutely not, obviously. And so Louis comes in on this conversation and, it just says, okay, I'm going to go out and, find this vampire and kill it or something, according to him. And so it's this interesting thing where they come across a series of creatures, actually, that are vampires. They do suck blood, but they are completely mindless. They have no mind. They can't even talk. They just go around, grabbing people, drinking their blood, and bringing them back to their cave like some kind of monster. And later we find out by the other vampires that this is called a revenant. So I've never heard of revenants. I've heard of it in like certain games before and other places, but I wonder if this is where a revenant actually comes from. So it's basically a mindless vampire. Which is really interesting and really grotesque and kind of ogreish looking, I guess. And so that's a very short chapter where they basically they go around Transylvania looking for vampires, but all they come across are these deformed demonic creatures that the people are very superstitious about, and they just kind of give up and say, well, let's go home to Paris because that's where I'm from. So that's what they give up. And it's actually kind of funny. I wish that was maybe expanded on more. I feel like that could be a whole Van Helsing like arc in their story where, they kind of get this notoriety like, oh, here's this vampire hunter who's actually a vampire himself. And they don't really expand on that. I thought that'd be a really cool like arc to go through, but that didn't happen. There's plenty of other media that covers that. And so finally you get to the third and final part of the book, which is Paris, in which they actually do find a vampire society. And in that section of the book, so Louis and Claudia, find this vampire society, and the main characters in this arc, there's, many male vampires, female vampires now, and they kind of have this secret underground society where they all convene and meet underneath this opera house in Paris called the Theatre des Vampires. Very original. And so there's 2 vampires that are really of note. One is called Armand, who apparently is the oldest living vampire there that they know of. And the other one is called Sebastian or something, or Santiago. And so Armand is very cordial and inviting and wants Louis and Claudia to join their little group or whatever. And he's the unofficial sort of leader, but not really. And Santiago is very suspicious of Louis and very aggravated by him, because when they first meet, Louis, without knowing who he is, because they kind of like Santiago's doing this copycat game with him in this alleyway, and so out of fear and out of frustration, Louis calls him a buffoon, And this is enough to just make him really pissed at him for the entirety of the rest of the book. And so Santiago is already upset with him, but he notices and he tries to create gossip that, well, you're a vampire and you know very little about the rules of vampires. And it's kind of known knowledge that every vampire has a vampire master who is supposed to teach him all these things. And so if you've come here, without a vampire master, he does say earlier that one of the strictest rules of vampire society, he says there really are no rules, but the strictest rule that will, result in your execution is that if you kill another vampire, if you kill one of your own kind. And so he says it's very curious that while you have an apprentice, you don't seem to know much about the rules of, vampire etiquette and whatnot, which makes us think that, where's your master? You couldn't be the master. And so Santiago tries to turn the other vampires against him, where Armand is much more forthcoming and understanding and wants basically to take Louis. He likes Louis and he wants to make him kind of his next apprentice, so to speak. And again, there's this really, really good scene where, going back to the themes of existentialism and religion, where Louis finally meets with Armand, because he's searching for other vampires, but he's also searching for knowledge of what are we? What is a vampire? Who is the first vampire? What is the point of all this? So who are we? And he comes to Armand, and I'm sorry if I'm saying his name wrong. Yeah, no, it is Armand. Okay, I'm right. But I looking through this, I forgot. There's one side story about this girl called Babette, who was his plantation's neighbor, the neighbor plantation, and basically, this is what really sets Louis off, is that Lestat basically was lusting after this boy of this plantation, and he was again the eldest brother with a mother, an elderly father, and 4 sisters under him. And so they have this whole thing where if this guy dies and his father's going to die soon, there'll be no one to defend the family from to run the business. And it's very unpopular in those days for a woman to be the head of the household and run a business. So Louis is you really shouldn't kill this guy. And Lestat's nah, but I want to. I want him. And so it's this really funny thing where the head boy is kind of challenged to a duel by this Spaniard because he insulted him or something. And so they go to the duel. They're all oh my God, what's going to happen? And so the boy actually wins the duel. But again, Lestat is so fixated on him, so worried that the Spaniard would kill him, that in his bloodlust, he chases the boy into the Louisiana, cold swamp and kills him. And Louis is wow. And so then it falls to Babette, the oldest sister in the family, to run the business. And from his empathy and sympathy, Louis basically visits Babette in the night, giving her advice on how to run the business, what to do, what to say, what deals to make, and basically make sure she doesn't put her family into poverty. And it's a real twist of fate where later on, when they're kind of on the run, Babette comes face to face with this person who's been whispering to her all, in the night all this time, and she's convinced that he's some creature of the devil, and she throws her lantern at him, and he catches fire, and is kind of assaulted by the very person he wanted to help. And it's this kind of thing: no matter what you do, you'll always be different to them. And so when Louis finally meets Armand, and he basically says, so you're the oldest vampire. It's okay, how long have you been alive? And he's about 4 centuries. And he says, basically, I was from Venice in the 15th or 14th century or something, but I've only been alive for over 400 years. That's it. And so he says, really? So, and he says, so what are vampires? Are we children of the devil? Are we beasts or agents of the devil? What are we? Do we serve Satan? And Armand basically says, I have no idea. And he goes on to say, if we are children of the devil, then the devil was also made by God, in which case that would make us children of God as well, which means that we are also, not without sin and not without the possibility of redemption. And this destroys Louis, because this is what he's been searching for his whole life up until this point. the reason for his being, like what is the purpose of being before and after being a vampire? What is the point of life? And in the process of searching far and wide for hundreds of years and hundreds of kilometers to Paris, he's met by the oldest living vampire with the most knowledge, who basically says, I have no idea. And this just this just wrecks the poor boy, the poor man Louis, because he's so fraught, he's so distraught with trying to find meaning and purpose that the one place that he imagined he could find it, he can't. Which means there are no answers except the ones we give ourselves. And they get past that, and basically Armand is like, Louis, I like you. I want you to be my apprentice. And he says, I love you. And so it's this whole other arc where Claudia is like, I realize that you're going to leave me for Armand because he's like the person that you admire. He has the knowledge. He has, the gentleness that you need. And so it's like I kind of believe that, I guess. I mean, I thought that he and Claudia had a good relationship, but at the same time, Claudia had also changed. And so it's this kind of whole thing where they're breaking up so he can be with his, French master or something. And so what they do in the meantime is, he realizes that, like he says he already knows he's going to leave Claudia for this new relationship, essentially. And so, oh, by the way, Armand gives a very important piece of information that vampires do not take fall damage. Apparently they can just jump off buildings and skyscrapers and be totally fine. So good to know. Thank you. So yeah, I mean, who wouldn't want to know that? So Louis like, I gotta be with this guy. I got to know, and just live the life that I feel I deserve. And so in the meantime, what they do is it's this weird scene where Louis basically takes this. Well, actually, it's interesting that so Claudia has been going to this doll shop, and recently she's been obsessed with the fact that she's not a woman and wants to become a woman so that she can express her love to Louis, because she feels like if she could do that, she could keep him, but she can't because she's a child, and that drives her mad. And so she keeps going to this doll shop where this woman who makes these dolls is infatuated with her because she's this beautiful, perfect, plump little girl, and all of her dolls resemble her, and so she becomes her inspiration. And so she asks the doll maker to make her a doll that is a woman doll. And so she does that for her. And it turns out that this woman, Madeleine, was doing this for Claudia because, and is a doll maker because she lost her own child when it was very young or something. And so she's kind of fixated on recreating and, kind of healing that sorrow and that tragedy. So again, there's another tragic story. And so Claudia takes Madeleine back to their apartment in Paris. And so Louis basically takes Madeleine and turns her into a vampire so that she can be a companion to Claudia because she is obsessed with her and loves her and needs her. And then it's revealed later that Armand was the one who was mind controlling Louis to do that. And I was like, I guess, sure. I don't know. It just felt like an overcomplication. I'm like, I guess. So you wanted to make sure that Claudia was happy so that you could have Louis. So to show that it's like a mutual desire between the two vampires that they want to be together. And it's not just Louis wanting to be with Armand. I guess that's the idea. Anyway, so this occurs. And then there's kind of this other thing where they've kind of, they've done this and Madeleine is happy and Claudia's happy and Armand and Louis are happy. And then they come back to the opera house one evening and Santiago and Celeste and the other vampires waiting for them. But then also in the front and center stage, is, Lestat. And so Santiago arrests Claudia and Louis, and so basically Lestat comes back, but he's still scarred from the attack, but he's still very pissed at Louis, and so they bring him before them, and so it's this final judgment and trial, and so Lestat finally gets his revenge, but he still desires Louis. He still wants him because who he's grown fond of. And so he realizes that even though he was drugged, he realizes that Louis was an onlooker. He couldn't stop Claudia, and that Claudia was the real criminal. Like, he's that Claudia killed me. But even though he condemns only Claudia, Santiago takes this as the opportunity to condemn them both. And so what happens is Louis is buried underground, and they put mortar and bricks over. They put them in this coffin, which is then locked, and then they put mortar and things over him. And it's actually a very scary scene because as a vampire, you cannot die. So being confined to this eternal box forever is actually very terrifying, because you'll wake up every night and just stare at a ceiling and go crazy. Basically, it's actually pretty horrifying, worse than actually dying, frankly. And it does make sense for the trope that, like, oh, you find this ancient sarcophagus, or this ancient coffin, and it's like, you have disturbed my eternal slumber. And it makes sense if you can't die and you're in a box covered deep underground that's super cursed, and you unlock this thing. It's like, not only is this person punished for some reason, but they've also gone mad from the amount of time they spent there. So it's a really cool concept that, until it was written in this book, it makes sense. The eternal mummy or the eternal vampire or something. So I think it's really cool. And so, of course, what happens, though, he's praying and praying for Armand to come and rescue him. And it's like the next evening, Armand somehow finds him, breaks it open, and takes him out. And he's like, Louis, like, I thought you were the leader of these guys. Why couldn't you stop them? And he's like, I'm a leader, but every vampire is so powerful. There's no such thing really as a strong man or a leader. I can only advise them, but I am taking you back and basically making a case for you. And so he saves Louis, basically, and even Lestat basically orders them to save him. And it's so funny that Louis, in his travels, realizes, I think in Transylvania or Paris, how lonely it is to not know and be alone, and how Lestat, like, he understood what Lestat was getting at. And so when he actually finally comes back to Lestat and admits, yeah, okay, I'll come with you, Lestat for the first time is literally in tears. Like, he's super emotional and not the vampire he knew at all in that moment. And of course, unfortunately, though, he just says, well, what's happened to Claudia and Madeleine? And Santiago leads him into the kitchen, and they've been burned to death inside an oven. So I guess that's one way to kill a vampire, is you just turn them basically to ashes. And so you have this kind of Pompeii outline of Madeleine holding Claudia, and Louis kind of has this moment. And and so I don't think he flies into a rage then, but then he does plot his revenge, basically. And so Armand is like, okay, well, he said I couldn't stop them. Basically, I had to make sure that the code was upheld, and someone did have to pay the price for that. It doesn't make sense why they got Madeleine, though, because I guess she'd be without a master. I mean, she really didn't do anything wrong, really. It was just Claudia. So, but regardless, that's what happened. Also, something really interesting is that the way to describe Madeleine is she has like red hair, but violet eyes. And I just thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. I wonder how they adapt that in a show or a movie or whatever. But aside from that, what happens next is Louis is pissed, and he gets his revenge. And so he basically comes to the theater one night, douses it in kerosene, lights it on fire, and he also finds a sickle somewhere, and he comes after, Santiago, who really is coming after him. And so he takes the sickle and he basically decapitates the guy, and it's like, got him. This epic, Rambo moment. He got his revenge, and he basically escapes and burns this corrupt society of vampires to the ground. And then he, I believe, eventually, and Armand isn't there, and he notices he isn't there, and Armand reveals later, like, I knew you'd come, I knew you'd burn it down, and I didn't keep the guards there because I wanted to leave that life behind too. And so Armand and Louis basically travel the world, and they have their little honeymoon. Basically, they go, they basically travel through Europe. They end up in Greece and Asia Minor, and And then after some while, I forget the reason why exactly, but Louis kind of becomes homesick. And again, it's like when you can live forever, it's like, what's the point of meaning and being? And so they eventually end up going back to New Orleans. And it's the night that they're in New Orleans that, Louis finds out Lestat is still alive and in New Orleans. And so he sneaks away from Armand to go visit him. And it's actually a really kind of sad sight where he comes to Lestat, but he's completely different. He's not, I mean, hundreds of years have passed, but he's acting like an old man, where he's in this wheelchair. And I guess from the shock or the thing of being lonely or whatever, or the betrayal of Louis and Claudia, he's just wheelchair bound, and he's scared to go outside, and he's completely changed his character. And it's this really sad scene. And he does have this like servant slave boy who is also a vampire who takes care of him. But it's this weird thing where Lestat's like, oh, you've come back to me. And Louis is like, no, I haven't come back to you. I've only come back to see you temporarily. And I still don't forgive you for what you did to me. But just to see him like that, it really shakes up Louis. And he comes back later that evening to, Armand, and he's kind of concluded that chapter of his life and, his relationship. And I forget what he says to Armand, because Armand says something like, and so, I mean, I'll just read it because it's an odd scene where he says, that it was you who killed her, who forced her into that yard and locked her there. I asked, I smiled. Don't tell me you have been feeling pain for it all these years, not you. And then he closed his eyes and turned his face away, his hand resting on his chest as if I'd struck him an awful sudden blow. You can't convince me that you care about this, I said to him coldly. And I looked out towards the water, and again a feeling came over me, that I wished to be alone. And in a little while I knew I would get up and go off by myself, that is, if he didn't leave me first, because I would have liked to remain there actually. It was quiet and a secluded place. You care about nothing, he was saying. And then he sat up slowly and turned to me and said, I could see that dark fire in his eyes. I thought you would at least care about that. I thought you would feel the old passion, the old anger if you were to see him again. I thought something would quicken and come alive in you if you saw him, if you returned to this place. That I would come back to life, I said softly. And I felt the cold metallic hardness of my own words as I spoke, the modulation and control. It was as if I were cold all over, made of metal, and yet also fragile, so fragile as he had been actually for a long time. And so it's this kind of thing where, as you just live forever, your relationships, the things that matter to you, the feeling of your life, they just kind of fade away. And Louis becomes this, I guess, cold, distant person who doesn't even have passion in his life anymore. Passion for the things that matter to him, because I guess they were killed, like Claudia and Madeleine. And he's become a changed person, and Armand no longer recognizes him. He no longer feels the thrill and excitement that he was trying to recapture. And it's that very sad scene where basically Armand basically walks into the ocean or into like the water in the moonlight and just never to be seen again. He just goes out there, man. And that, and that's how Armand ends. And then he kind of says there were some other things that happened, and basically he said he wanted to leave that place to go to somewhere where he had no memories, no knowledge, and just start totally new. And so he ends up in San Francisco, and here he is. And that's the interview. That's the end of the interview with the vampire. So yeah, really, really great book. A very well written. I was just really fun to read some of these lines and dialogue. Sometimes they have very specific things like, he's like he said it in a cold, metallic way. The way that Anne describes the way the characters act and interact with each other and talk to each other, it's very visual. It's almost like Tolstoy. You can almost see the scene and the reaction and the movement, and she doesn't do it in an overbearing manner. I mean, she'll take some time to talk about the candelabras and the setting and what they were wearing a bit, but it's really about the actions between the characters. So it's a very character-focused book. Oh, I forgot to mention, there's one part at the end which is kind of like a cheesy little cliffhanger sequelitis kind of thing, where so the vampire in the interview, the boy is like, oh, I want to become a vampire. Like, I can't believe this is so crazy or whatever. And so the vampire's like, you tempt me, boy. But he ends up sucking his blood anyway, keeping him alive, and then fleeing in the night. And so the boy then takes his recording, plays it back, and thinks that, oh yeah, there's his description of where Lestat still lives, his disheveled house in New Orleans. And so this journalist boy, who is totally unnamed, I believe, in this book, ends up going after Lestat, and that's how the book ends. And it's like, all right, whatever. I mean, it's very impressive. Anne Rice, apparently, she's written 38 books in her career. So there's a lot of stuff, and it's like, there are a lot of things where it talks about totally new ideas, like the Queen of Darkness or something. What is this? Yeah, the Queen of the Damned. Like, there's a whole list of different books here. But then, kind of near the end, there's kind of like more about Prince Lestat, his story, Claudia's story. I love this last one, Prince Lestat in the Realms of Atlantis. That sounds like absolute cringe kino. But yeah, so there's a whole extended universe outside this book, that lots of other things. I don't know if I'd read another one of these. I mean, it was interesting to get that main idea, but I didn't fall in love with it, I guess. There's not something that I said, oh, I need to read the next one. I think it's very rare that I think I go after a book really for pleasure. It's really for challenge for me, and because what is this thing I need to decipher and solve the puzzle of what this person was getting at as an idea. But yeah, that is the book. Really beautifully written, really well written. Again, I just blew through it. Again, I think I would love to focus on that whole thing of Sorrow and his brother, and having Louis find meaning. I want Louis to have a good ending, or at least to have a harder protagonist versus antagonist thing with Lestat, where he's like, look, we just can't feed on humans. We need to protect them because they're living beings. They were living beings like us, and they have value. And besides Lestat just being an asshole, he has to. I wish there was more of a moral, outrage to Louis against Lestat, and more of a dynamic there where Lestat doesn't really become his partner anymore. He becomes a real antagonist in kind of a comic book-ish fashion. I think that'd be kind of cool. But either way, I understand the dynamic of the two affluent, very sophisticated men being super gay with each other and having these fabulous parties and having this weird, slightly toxic or usually very toxic dynamic. Is there such a thing as a non-toxic Yuri dynamic or non-toxic Yaoi dynamic? I'm sure it exists. I don't read it, obviously, but yeah, it just seems generally Yaoi's just kind of toxic in general. Maybe, I don't know. I don't read it. I don't know, but I think I kind of get it now. At least I like to think that. But yeah, it's a good book. I'd recommend it, and apparently there's some show about it recently. I know there's a 90s movie with Orlando Bloom. I vaguely remember that, but I definitely want to watch it again now and kind of get the full experience. But yeah, good book. Good book. I'd recommend it. It's easy to read, and if you like vampires, absolutely, go for this. Anyway, I think that's it for now. And as always, keep reading, guys. Take care. Bye.